Thank you so much, Noah. I often find myself squirming when I have to sit through my own bio. It feels really long. Usually, I don't know if other teachers experience this. I am so happy to be joining all of you. Happy winter solstice. This is an important day for most Indigenous peoples, and I'm really happy to speak with you from the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people here in Madison, Wisconsin. I am often what I want to do more than anything else most of the time is express my gratitude when I do land acknowledgements, because the Ho-Chunk people have taken care of the landscape and waterscape so carefully for future generations for thousands of years. And when I realized I would be speaking during winter solstice, I knew that what I wanted to talk about in some sense was time and the wisdom of winter and rest and regeneration. So it just feels very appropriate. And a lot of what I'm going to say is explorative for me, and sort of the thinking that is emerging out of a certain period of contemplation and pain, I think. So please bear with me if there are moments where I take a long time. So I think the first thing is to just mark where we are today in the year. It's the shortest day, the longest night of the year. For many cultures, it means the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun. It's a day when the waning of daylight hours is reversed. So this is the moment when we begin to embrace lightness and longer daytime and hours again. It feels like a good time to talk about time. As Buddhists, we are reminded so often that, at least conceptually, time itself is an artifact of the mind. But I feel like if you're anything like me, and reluctantly participating in samsaric life, then in some sense, we are worrying about the next thing we must do in every moment. And that creates a tyranny of time in relation to productivity. And it's we are all in some sense entrapped by capitalism in that sense. But winter is the time that we hope we get to rest and rejuvenate ourselves. It is certainly what I hope for when I enter winter. And it's almost like I allow myself to give the gift of time to myself, right? Because this is my retreat time usually. Then tomorrow I begin retreat. But what's fascinating to me is that for those of us who inhabit, samsara and are at the same time trying to practice the wisdom of Buddhism, we are aware of the dualism we introduce all the time on a daily basis. And what I became aware of this week is how dualistic this idea of time is that I've created, where I've separated rest and rejuvenation from the rest of the year. And it got me thinking about something that when you're in Wisconsin, you are sort of introduced to if you spend time in nature, right? And that is geological time. So in the last couple of years during COVID, I had in some sense, the opportunity, talking about dualism, the loneliness and the opportunity of being able to explore this geological phenomenon in the area, which was created by the last ice age. So it's basically all the landscape and waterscapes around Madison, Wisconsin. And it was created during what is called the Wisconsin glacial stage, which is one of the last eras in the Pleistocene era. So one of the last divisions of time, which began about 100,000 years ago. And I live really close to the Ice Age National Scenic Trail, which is a 1,000-mile hiking trail in Wisconsin. It's incredibly beautiful. Some of it is really suburban and urban, but a lot of it is natural areas. And what you see when you're on the trail is a landscape that was sculpted by an immense flow of glacial ice. So basically, during the Ice Age, temperatures began to warm 20,000 years ago, and the ice sheets began melting. And it sculpted a sort of unique landscape features. And these include moraines, which is when the glacier moves and it starts pushing all the sediment to the front. It's almost like an edge of the glacier. And then it began gouging out large parts of the earth. So it formed basins where all the water from the melting glaciers collected. And this is how the Great Lakes was created, right? These incredible freshwater seas, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and so on. And most of the lakes in Wisconsin were created by glaciation. So there is a kind of topography that's really unique. As you're walking there, you will find rocks and sediments that are not native to the area, but all of a sudden you'll see it there. Boulders, enormous boulders that have been moved from a different part of this, of this continent to this area. And wildlife that are adapted to these landscapes. So I've seen red fox and white-tailed deer and all kinds of squirrels and porcupines and evidence of gray wolves and black bears and a lot of golden eagles, which is really feel sacred, red-tailed hawks, and so on. So this is an area where geological time feels real. It's not conceptual. And in some sense, I feel like having had access to this awareness of geological time has brought me to this understanding of how the time that we count on a daily basis is truly empty in nature, right? The hours and the minutes and the seconds that rule our day. And geological time is essentially deep time. That is counted in the millions of years. So it's really conceptually kind of hard to grasp, isn't it? Because it seems so unreal to us. And the only way we perceive deep time is because it's reflected in the land's history. And maybe this is a good moment to explore that and settle our minds on the landscapes that surround us. So no matter where you are, no matter where you're tuning in from, and those of you who've just been in Zazen, I think this is a good moment just to take a moment and think about the landscape that you are in and what it contains, the history it contains, the deep time it contains, right? All the unique ecological features of the landscape, rivers and deserts and gorges and underground aquifers, moraines and summits and mountaintops and so on. You can think about the plant species that the landscape hosts, tall trees and short bushes and scrub and small desert flowers and wildflowers and fruit. What we humans have brought into the landscape, houses and buildings and new species, discarded things, gardens. And when we take a few steps back and think of all of these things as one ecosystem, what is that ecosystem's idea of time perception? It's a good moment to wonder and be aware of how the landscape breathes, right? And does your breathing change when you imagine it's the landscape breathing? It can be hard to grasp. We're a very short-lived species and a young species. We've been around for 200,000 years, But I think an emotion that can arise is something that is called deep time humility. And that is recognizing that this amount of time that humankind has been around and has graced the planet is just a tiny blip in the cosmic radar. And that life, the entirety of life, we are a tiny part of this entirety, the enormity of life. So I think this is not always easy. I think it can feel hard or even frightening for people, the immensity of time, right? Deep time, especially. But I think for some of us, it actually brings relief. Our human idea of time, I called it a tyrant earlier. It's a relentless kind of urgency that is created when we use this, breaking up time into 24 hours and then into minutes, into seconds. In some sense, we're trying to imprint superiority, almost the ability to conquer life by doing this, right? To control life. And I think when we inhabit Earth's time, deep time, that tyranny of now can be placed within a wider context. It's also, in some sense, it's the tyranny of our individualism and our individualistic desires, right? That we can place within a greater context. It's part of a reckoning that we are here for an infinitely small moment, but the land, life lives on. So for those of you who know me, I love wildlife. So this is a good moment to take, to honor wildlife around us, all life forms around us. And so let's take a moment and expand our awareness to all the life forms in the landscapes we inhabit. So think of wildlife that is touched by humans, untouched by humans, all the species that you see, that you are co-inhabiting the space with, millions of insects species, right? I don't know if you knew, but there are 1 million beetle species alone. Think about the flying animals, the swimmers, the mammals. How does time perception work for them? Let's explore. For most of us who are in urban settings, probably the species we'll think about first is our squirrels or insects that we get to see, sparrows, pigeons, and so on. And what's fascinating to me is that they all have a perception of time. Squirrels is a perfect example, right? They hibernate partly. They squirrel away nuts, preparing for winter, right? And so there is this, regardless of the difference between species, all species do have time perception. And I think most of us understand and are comfortable in the concept of seasonal time. And that brings me to the here and now, where we're talking about winter. In winter, for me, and for many of us who are practicing Buddhists, is the time to journey inwards. It is the time for slowing down, for inviting stillness into our life. It is a time for reflection and introspection and hibernation in some sense, right? So what do I mean by hibernation? I'm really talking about, well, biologically, that's a way animals conserve energy, right? They are trying to survive winter conditions, adverse weather conditions, lack of food, trying to protect themselves. And there is an actual physiological change that happens. Their body temperature drops, the metabolism slows down, right? A lot of mammals exhibit seasonal dormancy. And it's something where there's a lot of really interesting research coming out, because there's actually talk about extending life and introducing hibernation patterns in humans. So there is this whole field of science that's looking at that. But when I think about how that reflects in our human world, well, winter is also the time where we sleep more, we cuddle more, we soothe more, right? We wrap ourselves in blankets and huddle around fires. It's also a time when we are, trying to conserve energy for ourselves. And in some sense, where we allow a lot of the external facing characteristics and habits to fall away, because we know we're spending time with our loved ones, or we're spending time in a safe space. And there are lots of similarities with how wildlife act in hibernation mode, and how we humans act as well, right? So maybe because we spend time more at home, we have less vigilance, we're less worried about predators. We allow our fears to fall away a little bit more. And this energy of hibernation, this lack of energy of hibernation, the torpor, is something that seasonally, historically, has been part of human existence, right? It's something that we were really comfortable with. It's something that there is not an agrarian civilization that did not make hibernation a part of their seasonal life, right? You gathered all your crops, and then you had a big festival, and then everybody slept a lot until spring came. And I think one of the difficulties of modern life is all of that has gone away, right? Even this conceptual connection to the land and to the earth, the idea of seasons affecting human behavior has dissolved, right? And so in a weird sense, we have lost the wisdom of what winter brings, the paradoxes of life that winter allows us to embrace, right? The darkness and light that I was talking about earlier, the death and rebirth, joy and grief, scarcity and plenty. And I think one of the things that happens when we do not give ourselves this time, this winter time, this sort of the dark time, the animal time, right? When we do not give ourselves the space, what happens is we are immediately introducing imbalance in our lives. We're kind of giving more value to one thing over the other, right? So light gets more value than darkness, rebirth gets more value than death. Life gets more value than that death. And joy, of course, gets much greater value than grief. And so what happens is we are immediately introducing a dualism and a pyramid of preferences. But we know, for those of us who are contemplatives, we know that the necessity of paradoxical opposites, we cannot have night without day. We cannot have darkness without light. We cannot have life without death, and vice versa. And one of the main reason why I'm in this space trying to explore this and understand it and make sense out of it is because lately, what, Noah mentioned, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I've actually been doing it probably 30 years, because I started as an activist at the age of 15 and have always been involved in environmental movements. One of the things that I've lately become really aware of is how the environmental and the climate movement has adopted this frenetic concept of time and urgency, right? So the tyranny of now, that tyranny of immediacy, has taken over the movement. And we all know why. We all know the tensions that come from knowing we are running out of time. The language is really evocative. We're in a race, we're in a war. If you work on climate change, you are always aware of the countdown clocks, right? The alarms, the number of years we have before we bring down the global warming rate. But one of the things that happens when we sort of value only this kind of time is that this kind of urgency, this vocabulary, right, of dualism, then what we're doing is entering a zero-sum game where we must conquer and beat time. And I lately have been thinking about how necessary it is for us to embrace deep time, slow time, learn from indigenous traditions like the Ho-Chunk people to build movements that last 7 generations, right? That last through thousands of years, instead of feeling this urgency and therefore being driven by it to just apply band-aids to things we broke within one generation, right? I think this brings me to why I began working with faith leaders and why I moved away from the conservation work I used to do, right? I used to manage big field programs and design projects and so on. I really needed to explore philosophically what the paradoxical opposites are of despair and crisis, and of eco-anxiety and climate distress in particular. The world we imagined in the future and have grieved so much for has come to pass. You know, today we know 1 million species are at risk of extinction. I saw a really scary scientific paper recently that said that only 3% of Earth's land surface can now be considered ecologically intact, which means basically untouched by humans, right? Left alone. And in a state of robustness, in a state of where the ecology is thriving. And of course, we know with climate change, we're fully on course for warming at 2.7 degrees centigrade. And we need it to be 1.5 if we want life as we know it today to survive. So there is this real sense of loss and grief that all of us are carrying. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and this brings me again to the way dualism has diminished in some sense the work we do, is that science, and Western science in particular, has created these boxes and these labels where climate is in one box, biodiversity is in another box, forests are in a different box, right? And so we as humans are constantly categorizing because we want to make sense of the world. But, you know, nature recognizes no such divisions. There are no divisions in nature. Any one of these systems, when it gets harmed and it starts being stressed, it is going to transfer that stress to another system, right? And so it's going to compound the stress as to all the systems that exist. It's not like we can hold climate change in just that category. Climate change is stressing for us, right? Which is stressing biodiversity. And I think the necessity to break down these conceptual barriers that we've created to sort of allow the mess to come in, for us to allow a full spectrum understanding of nature and our place in it, is so necessary. You know, I mentioned earlier eco-anxiety and climate distress, and I don't know how many of you are experiencing it. You can raise your hand if you feel fear or anxiety or grief around climate change and environment. But I think one of the things that, you know, so I can explain what eco-anxiety is, which is basically the sense of fear and anxiety and a sense of doom around what is coming, right? The environmental and climate impacts of what is coming. And when I first created the LOCA initiative, there were about 20 faith leaders that attended it because I really needed their advice to tell me what was most important. And Roshi Joan was one of the faith leaders who came and gave the advice. And something I did not anticipate in that meeting, so we had 20 faith leaders, 20 scientists, 20 experts, and so on in that big convening, was one of the climate scientists actually spoke up and said, the biggest contribution faith leaders could make to the environmental and climate movement was to help people deal with the sorrow and the grief and the rage and the guilt and so on. And it made me understand and realize that LOCA, whatever it is we do, we have to actually take on these issues. So, you know, when the LOCA initiative's vision is that inner community and planetary resilience are interdependent. You cannot achieve any one of these things without working on the other two. And as part of that work, in the last year, I have pulled together a team of scientists at the Center for Healthy Minds, who mostly psychologists, talking about things like emotional granularity around eco-anxiety and climate distress, but also spending a lot of time talking about resilience. And what has become really evident to me lately is that when we talk about inner resilience, I think there has been a real tendency to focus on the distress reduction part of inner resilience, right? So when we usually talk about inner resilience, our focus goes on calming down our anxiety and our guilt and our anger. And it's like, calm down, calm down, calm down. But there's actually an equal part to it. And this is why winter is so important, because that's the part of increase. That's the part of increasing our reserves and our joy, right? It cannot just be reducing distress. There has to be a part where we're increasing our reserves. And the most important part of the reserves is joy. Finding ways for us to access more joy, finding more access points to joy, finding more resources, right? That it's almost like we need that layer of fat that squirrels have. And that is key for our human resilience, right? And if we take away anything as winter's wisdom, or wisdom from winter, or wisdom from seasonal time, it is this, the importance of rest and rejuvenation. As movement builders, as healers, as faith leaders, right? This, the tyranny of productivity means that we never get to stop running. And we are in this artificial sort of, we created the wheel, with the samsara wheel, literally, we created it. We jumped on it and we're running on it. And we've decided we cannot get off, right? It's sort of this trap that keeps going. And I think we do it with the best of intentions, with the greatest, most compassionate aspirations and hopes. We want to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings. And what I am realizing is those of us who are in roles of service, and that includes faith leaders, that includes, social workers, doctors, right, nurses, teachers, environmentalists, I think we've forgotten that the most important part of our resilience has to come from being able to let go of that tyranny of now and inhabit seasonal time, land time, deep time. How much time do I have? Okay, I can speak a little more. And I think that, how am I doing, Noah?
Good, till 6:30, so 13 minutes.
Okay, all right, great. Are we doing Q&A, or is it just the talk and then we pause and practice?
Usually just the talk, and then we chant the 4 vows, and that's it. Okay,
all right. So you're on this journey with me. I'm on a journey and I'm taking you with me. And so going back to the importance of deep time and allowing ourselves to experience it, I think in some sense puts a spotlight on the way we view not just time, but the earth, right? Because if we think of time as something to conquer, and time actually is earth time, what we're saying is we need to conquer the earth. And this is how we've ended up in the Anthropocene era, right? Where humans have put a footprint on every aspect of the planet. But I also think what we've done is created this sort of patriarchal and colonial narrative about the human species being at war with nature. And that, we as individuals are basically, either going to fight to protect humans or going to fight to protect nature. And there is no third choice, right? It's really forced this dualism and this sense of being in an adversarial role with nature. And I think going back to indigenous wisdom, this is why the importance of indigenous wisdom is so key in the movements we build, in the service we do, right? Because this is where I think the wisdom of deep time is most intact. And also we know that indigenous peoples are less than 5% of the global population, but they protect 80% of biodiversity today, right? And that in itself is really, that's evidence for what they have not given up in the relationship with the earth, right? And the relationship with deep time. And this awareness that what they're building has to last many generations and not just our short lifetime. I think when we inhabit deep time and explore it, one of the things that's going to come front and center is impermanence and our understanding of our own impermanence in a very tangible way, of our lives, the lives of our loved ones, which is often harder to deal with than our own lives, of our species. And this is a moment that I really want to emphasize the necessity of working on these issues through the lens of interdependence, because otherwise it can very easily lead us into sort of nihilistic chaos, right? Where it's like, well, if life is so short, then why does anything matter? And we need that lens of interdependence to remind us that we are part of a greater identity, that we are in some sense contributing to a greater cause, right? Our contributions to life, Earth's life, the planet's life, deep time life, means we live forever, right? And so that sense of the ease that brings is really necessary for us if we're trying to steer this vehicle away from, a warlike approach towards how we solve the environmental and climate crisis. And I think going back to what I talked about earlier about eco-anxiety and climate distress, the hate that I see some activists show, the anger I see some activists express, and the grief, of course, that is underlying all of this, we need that deep time to experience comfort and relief from those emotions. And we need this sense of continuity to know that our lives are part of a larger tapestry of life, right? That we as individuals come and go, die, reborn, regenerate, ecologically, that's literally what happens, right? And that it doesn't change the tapestry. We're woven into the tapestry, and the tapestry just exists, continues to exist. I think that's a good place to stop. I can, if anyone has questions, this is a good place for me to pause and just make sure everyone's okay.
Sure. Thank you, Dekila. We could take questions from the Zendo, or if anybody on YouTube, there's a little bit of a delay, so it might take a minute, but if anybody on YouTube wants to ask a question, you can put it in the chat and I'll relay it to Dekila. Okay. I have a question while we're waiting. You mentioned that 3% of the Earth's surface is if I understand, it's been like not touched by human disturbances.
Ecologically intact, yeah, which means that it is existing the way nature has intended it to, right? Where all the ecosystems are functioning exactly as it should. But because of our sort of, disproportionate influence on the planet, very little of the planet is not impacted by us. I don't remember the number, but I remember reading recently, for example, light pollution, right? There are very few places left on the planet where there is perfect night sky. Most, I think it's like 95% of the planet now has some light pollution in the night, no matter what. And so that's a perfect example of saying, right, like that's the ecological intactness that we're losing. And for someone like me who grew up being able to see a perfect Milky Way, there is grief. There's a lot of grief. And I think for those of us who are trying to bring the wisdom of our spiritual traditions into environmental and climate work, and I would say knowing Upaya's community, a lot of the sort of medical work and caregiving work that people are involved in, I think one of the things that we really need to embrace is the grief, knowing that it's equal measure to the joy, right? You cannot have the joy without it. And I think one of the things in the last week as I've been preparing for a retreat that I've been really trying to embrace is also that frenetic, energy that I described that comes with the tyranny of now, not hating that, right? Not being able to not other it even more than we do, right? And treat it as an alien thing, but sort of saying, okay, that also, when you are in this space of emptiness and impermanence, then and interdependence, then you have to allow for even these things that we think of as unnatural to be part, to have value. And so taking that energy and applying it to the work we do is really important, right? How are we creating change without othering the thing we want to change? How are we influencing the systems that we are forced to participate in without, in some sense, treating them like it's criminal? And these systems are, in many senses, like really uncompassionate at a cellular level, right? So how do we do it in a way where we actually are still able to reflect compassion to it while trying to dismantle it? And I think a lot of that, for me, requires being in a mental space of deep time, being able to remind myself that the emotions that are rising in the moment where I'm filled with rage or filled with outrage, that's an even better word, when we see injustice and the outrage that comes, right? That instant outrage that we experience, we need deep time to balance that. We need deep time to remind ourselves that we are just like a small weft in the tapestry, we're just this tiny little knot that is in the tapestry. And what we're trying to do is keep the tapestry thriving, right? To build it and to make sure that it continues to be as rich as it is, And I think that for me, actually giving this talk and thinking about this talk has been the gift for me, because it's allowed me to really inhabit this space of deep time and compassion. And I think even temper my own sense of urgency to heal the climate and environmental movements I'm part of, right? To, in some sense, trust that it will come through, it will happen. And part of that means allowing ourselves to slow down and be in the space of just being, right? Just inhabiting deep time.
Thank you, Dekila. It brings us almost to the end, but a couple questions did come into the YouTube chat, and so I'll just say them together. One is, what book do you recommend? What would you say we should read? And the second is, can we save the species that you said are on the verge of extinction?
It's a really good question. So we have, I think, 23 species that went extinct last year. That were declared extinct in North America alone. But it's fascinating. And I have to tell you, like, talking about not othering, there are tons of scientists I know and that I work with, biodiversity scientists, who are really excited about genetic manipulation and about sort of unfreezing species, genetically, and playing with the genetic material to sort of
Jurassic Park.
Right? Like bring back mammoths, Jurassic Park. That's right. And it's really hard for me not to other them instantly and be like, feel that sense of outrage and react to it. But I know that people will try all kinds of things, including probably very ill-advised things. And I think there are a lot of species we will lose along the way. But, the planet existed before the Ice Age and was transformed into these beautiful lakes in this region that has created so much life, so much joy, right? Areas of thriving. And I think for me that inhabiting deep time means that I am protected from that anxiety and fear of loss of individual species, because my eyes and my heart is in life, right? Is in the protection of life as a whole. And I think that tapestry that I was talking about, which might not be the best analogy, but ecosystems, sort of thinking about the ecosystem itself. And I think that, I hope that is a gift that helps for those of us who are really heartbroken about individual species loss, And what's fascinating to me too is what we're seeing is a lot of adaptability too among species. As painful as it is, it's always noticeable and notable to me that tigers, for example, are being found in higher and higher altitudes in the Himalayas. They're climbing. As the temperature is rising, they're climbing. And so there are species that are reacting, right? We know tree lines are moving, trees are moving north. And so I think there is, I think life as it is will thrive. I think what we know as an individualistic idea of life around us may change, but that is the importance of embracing impermanence, right? And finding ways where we don't turn away from the grief that it creates, and we turn towards the joy that it brings when we work on resilience and inner, community, planetary resilience, all three things,
Dekila, thank you so much. What a perfect reflection for the winter solstice. And I'll take that advice and maybe take some naps.
That's my plan for retreat, really. It's practice and sleep. I wish the same.
Thank you. Yeah. The first few days of retreat is always getting your sleep debt taken care of. Thank you so much, Dekila. We'll end with the 4 great Bodhisattva vows.